able to learn the skills and the sciences of the Chaldeans, which are the name for the Babylonian wise men, without adopting the heathen elements mingled with them. And so it's some possible reasons for them that helped them to keep their faith. That they first, remember, before they ever got to Babylon, we believe that they made a firm resolution to be faithful to God. And then they chose, or they willed, because choosing in your use of your will is the same thing, to do right and to shun evil. The right exercise of the will is extremely important. And you can find a nice paragraph on that in Steps to Christ, page 48, about the right exercise of the will. They depended on the power of God. They recognized that a single departure from principle would have weakened their sense of right and wrong, leading them to apostasy. And another point was that they had a consistent prayer life, a necessity due to the pagan atmosphere that constantly surrounded them. So that's what gave them the strength to deal with having to be in an environment that was continuously infused with paganism. Now, in verse 17, it tells us that Daniel was granted. Shirley?
We have something to add to that.
Oh, okay, please do.
Stephanie, too. When Corey was in law school, she was valedictorian at University of Dayton downtown. And of course, when graduation time comes, the valedictorian is supposed to give a speech. And the graduation's on Sabbath. And people, there's gray area with people. Families feel differently about it, but we had nothing to say either way. But Corey did. She said, I refuse to give the speech because I refused to go to graduation because it was on Sabbath. Now, that's one issue. But she said, further reaching than that is just what Daniel and his friends were facing. If I give in on this, then in my law career, when there are millions of dollars at stake and we just need you to come in this Saturday morning and get this contract signed before the end of the fiscal year, would you just do that for us? And she feels totally God is the wind beneath her wings because she's already made that decision. And she has been so thankful that at that time in her young life, she had the spiritual maturity to take that stand, and we're so thankful for her.
That's why I'm thanking you for sharing that. That's great. Anybody else got a good story like that? Want to share? Steph?
I don't have a good story, but I have a comment.
Okay.
To me, something that's very important in this, what we're talking about, remaining faithful, is that Daniel had friends of like mind. And I'm sure that they shared with one another and gave each other strength. And God tells us to stand together. And he also tells us to not stand with those of different beliefs that would influence you. And so I think it was important that they had each other.
I think that was very, very important for their success, that they helped each other out. Hey, Nora.
When you said about young age, when I was in 7th or 8th grade, I can't remember which year it was, our science teacher in a public school, we had a section on evolution. And I told the teacher, right after she gave us the assignment, I said, I'm sorry, I can't do this. She goes, why? I said, because I'm a Christian. She goes, well, technically I am too, but they make me teach it. She goes, but if you want to do your assignment on creation and give all the texts that support it, that'll be fine with me.
That's good. I love that. Anybody else got something they want to share on this? This is very important. You may remember Walter Veit, those of you who watched Walter. He was an evolutionist, atheist evolutionist, a God hater. And when he became converted, he was teaching at university in South Africa. And of course, it was totally evolutionary. Everything had to be evolutionary. In fact, he came under terrific pressure to you lose your job, and he really needed work. His wife had been in an accident; she had been sick, and he was struggling at that time. And so he prayed about it, and decided he would take a stand. No, I will not continue teaching evolution. And so the Lord worked it out for him so that the university gave him a position to teach in which evolution was not a part of it. And that really kind of saved his career and his ability to earn money for his family. So that's another story. I mean, I'm sure that many people have many, many stories about how God blessed them by them taking a stand for Him, by the right choice, by being willing to do what God asked you to do. It's important. Yeah. Thank you for those. That's really great. All right, in verse 17 continued, these visions and dreams of the 4 young Hebrews, Daniel was chosen by God to be his special messenger. And it doesn't ever say anything else about the other three boys. It seems that Daniel was the one God chose. Daniel seems to be kind of the leader of the group of 4. And God has chosen Daniel to be his special messenger. Daniel was given the prophetic gift. And it was not that he was so good at successful at the university. It was because God saw something in Daniel that he knew Daniel would stay faithful to him. So he was called by God to do a special work, to receive some of the most important prophecies of all time. That's a big statement. In verse 18, at the end of the 3 years of training, Daniel and his friends stood before King Nebuchadnezzar. These 4 young men, now they're about age 21, we're told in Prophets and Kings that in physical strength and beauty, I guess the countenance, how well they looked, in mental vigor, in literary attainment, they stood above and unrivaled by anyone else that went to the University of Babylon. They were 21. So,
What page, she asked, was that from?
oh, I thought you said what age. Prophets and Kings, page 186, if you'd like to look that up. Okay. All right, so what kind of questions would they be asked? Did the king himself ask the question? I kind of think he did, because these were men who were going to be working directly with him, so he wanted to see what they were thinking. So it doesn't say, but that's just my impression. So it's known that in Babylon they enjoyed riddles, and this was kind of a sport in the court life, everybody making up riddles and asking each other riddles. The exams may have involved solving math problems and astronomical problems, in which the Babylonians were masters at math and astronomy. The superior wisdom of Daniel and his friends wasn't the result of chance or even a miracle. These young men had applied themselves diligently and conscientiously to their studies, and God blessed their endeavors. Human effort alone avails nothing, but when it's combined with divine power, great success results. So, what did they study when they were there in the University of Babylon? It's called exact science. This is pure science, I guess we would say today. Astronomy, mathematics, linguistic studies. They mastered cuneiform. If you've ever seen cuneiform, it is like just little chicken feet marks all over the tablets. I don't know how anybody ever learned this. It's unbelievable. It's just like us trying to learn Chinese. It would be the same thing. Okay, and so they mastered this. Now this is all in 3 years' time. Writing and reading plus other languages. They had to be fluent in all the languages that related to Babylon, the empire that Babylon had conquered. They had to be able to speak in those languages. So it's no telling how many languages that they used. Now, combined with that and added to the pure sciences were dark sciences, divination, magic, exorcism, astrology. This was widespread among the ancient people, and it was practiced by men of science. They looked at the entrails and livers of animals. Oh, what can you learn from a liver? And they compared that with what they saw in the models. They had these clay models of livers, and they would compare what they saw in the liver from the animal with the clay liver. Oh. Now here you go from intellectual information down to something as superstitious as reading a liver. Oh my. So, oh, and don't forget this one. Here's a couple other interesting ones. They would shake the arrows in the container where the arrows were and throw them on the floor, and whichever way they pointed, that's the way to go.
Where are you finding this? It's so interesting.
This is coming from, a lot of this is coming from Bible commentary.
Okay.
If you have a Bible commentary, just go to the book of Daniel and look it up and you can find more. There's a lot more stuff. Obviously, I can only give you a certain amount. Okay, so let's finish with this. Now, another one that they connected with was spirits of demons. They thought they were the spirits of the dead, but we know that the dead know nothing according to the Bible. But the demons were working with these magicians, these scientific people. So this is some of the stuff that Daniel and his friends were immersed around and in, but they just seemed to move right through it, and it wasn't affecting them. It didn't stick to them at all. So these magicians, these magi's, these wise men, supposedly, now they followed the king, like Nebuchadnezzar, on military campaigns. They went on hunting expeditions with him. They went on state visits with him. They advised him on dates to attack an enemy. The life of the king was largely regulated and ruled by these men. These men had some power, because the king couldn't do anything unless he ran and asked the magicians what he should do, what direction should he go, what should he say. So they are very powerful people. Though skilled in the act of divination and magic, the wise men of Babylon were also scholars in the true science, which we've just discussed. They also engaged in strict scientific studies, so we have to give them some credit for that. They were very good at their intellectual stuff. They became skilled in astronomy and being able to predict with accuracy the lunar and the solar eclipse. Their mathematical skills were highly developed, and they were very good at architecture and were great builders. They even developed a medical profession in which they were able to cure many diseases. Daniel and his friends excelled at all of these arts. So wow, what an education he got. All right, so Daniel,
Lord really blessed
he really did. That's right. They applied themselves, but then God added to that. That's right, and that's what happened for anybody. I used to tell my students at school, if you just pray and ask Jesus to help you, give attention to Him first, and then He will bless you and help you to be a good student and to achieve good goals. So Daniel lived through the 70 years, as we know, in exile. He was taken into Babylon in the year 605 BC. And Babylon fell in 536 BC. And then the children of Israel were, about that time, the 70 years were up, and they were on their way back to the promised land. But Daniel never left. He stayed there his entire life. I have a handout I wanted to give on, which is somewhat not exactly what we just talked about, but it is in some ways. It's called The End Time Dimension of Daniel. And it talks about the relationship of Daniel's experience with our experience at the end of time. So I thought it would be beneficial, since what we're trying to do is how can we apply Daniel's experiences to our own? Well, obviously we're not going to the University of Babylon. We're not going to be studying all that stuff. But there's some things that we should be able to learn from this that might be inspiring for us as end of time folks. So let me hand some of these around. Take one of them. I got holes punched in them for you so you can put them in your notebook.
Why do you think Daniel didn't go with the Israelites to the promised land? Do you think it's because he knew that God wanted to stay there?
That would be the first thing I would say. Yeah, that's where God wanted him to be. And in fact, he was very old too at that time.
Yeah.
So. Has everybody got one? It's a front and back page. Has everybody got one now? So you can underline, you can draw and write on it, or make a note on it and whatnot. You'll see how it's set up. This comes from Stephen Bohr's Studies of Daniel, which is a 459-page book, seminar that he gave. The man is so detailed. He's so detailed, he boggles my mind. I have to stop reading sometimes. It's just page after page after page of interesting historical or spiritual information that is just one of the best I've ever read. So I'm going to share this. I'm going to read this with you. I'm going to read it. You follow along looking at it. Okay? So it talks about at the beginning, the experience of Daniel and his friends illustrate and prefigure the experience of God's final remnant. Now we want to know about that because we are the final generation. We are the remnant church. So how does Daniel's experience affect us? Let's see what we can learn from it. And then you'll notice there's lots and lots and lots of Bible references in parentheses. I would suggest that you could use this as maybe as a morning devotion where you go in and you look up some of the text and get some more value out of it, because I'm not going to go through all these texts. It would be here forever. So your job is to, once we've read through this to see the basic idea, then you take that and look up the Bible text, see how they mesh with it. First of all, Daniel had no blemish or fault. The same will be true of the end time generation. Daniel was filled with the Holy Spirit, as will the end time generation. Daniel and his friends were men of prayer. Now, Counsels on Diets and Food says that Daniel's clearness of mind and firmness of purpose, his strength of intellect in acquiring knowledge, were due in a great degree to the plainness of his diet in connection with his life of prayer. All right, so Daniel, next one, Daniel was greatly beloved. Daniel and his friends followed strict temperate habits. From the book Maranatha, page 81, it says, "Let none who profess godliness regard with indifference the health of the body, and flatter themselves that intemperance is no sin and will not affect their spirituality. A close sympathy exists between the physical and the moral nature. The standard of virtue is elevated or degraded by physical habit. Excessive eating of the best of foods will produce a morbid condition of moral feelings. And if the food is not the most helpful, the effects are still more injurious. Any habit which does not promote healthful action in the human system degrades the higher and nobler faculties. Indulgence of appetite strengthens the animal propensities, giving them ascendancy over the mental and spiritual powers." Maybe that's one reason we have so many people who are just out of control in their lives because of their diets. Eating processed foods all the time is very detrimental to mental and physical health.
On this paper that you have, does somebody have a page that only has one side? It should be two-sided.
Things driving me crazy.
Okay.
You're okay? All right, yeah, that was my main copy that you were talking about. Daniel witnessed in the courts of kings of Babylon and Medo-Persia. God's people will also stand in the court of kings. I would think that there would probably be kings. We don't have very many kings anymore, but there are governments that we can have. We will stand in before governments. The lives of Daniel and his friends were governed by principle. They did not allow circumstances that surrounded them to influence their decisions and behavior. They were faithful even in the smallest duties, and they would have rather died than to be unfaithful to God. Prophets and Kings, page 487, says it was faithfulness in the little things that gave complexion to their whole life. They honored God in the smallest duties as well as in the larger responsibilities. And then from the Sanctified Life, page 20, Daniel possessed the grace of genuine meekness. He was true, firm, and noble. He sought to live in peace with all, and while he was unbending as the lofty cedars whenever principle was involved, in everything that did not come in collusion with his allegiance to God, he was respectful and obedient to those who had authority over him. But he had so high a sense of claims of God that the requirements of earthly rulers were held subordinate. He would not be induced by any selfish consideration to swerve from his duty. I was thinking about Daniel in the sense of, was Daniel really like, became a Babylonian? His name was changed to a Babylonian name He worked for Babylon. He did his very best. I thought to myself, is he really became a Babylonian patriot? And then as I thought more about it, I said, and this kind of clarifies that Daniel did his work as though he were doing it to God, not to Babylon. So everything he did for Babylon would have been done the same for God, because that's who he was working for. And I think that makes a lot of sense. The issues involved in the final conflict will be the same. Here's the issue, y'all. God's law and worship. Those are the two things, and we'll see that as we move into the other chapters. A death decree was proclaimed against Daniel and will be proclaimed against God's people. Daniel and his friends went through a severe time of trouble and trial, but came through victoriously. We always got to keep a vision on the victory that God will give us, as will God's faithful remnant at the end of time. Daniel was hated by religious leaders of his day, as will happen with the remnant at the end of time. Daniel denounced the placing of unholy wine in holy vessels. Now, spiritually speaking, wine is false doctrines, putting false doctrines into holy vessels. That would be the vessels could represent the bodies, just like Pastor's sermon this past week about the water pots. The same will happen at the end. Daniel was an insignificant faithful minority, while the majority was an apostasy, and the same will be true at the end. And from the great controversy we read, Daniel and his friends were delivered from their enemies, and their enemies were destroyed with the very weapons they intended to use on God's people. The furnace slew those who threw them in the 3 young men. The lions ate those who prepared the plot against Daniel. Evil Haman died on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. In the end, the weapons which were to slay God's people will be used to slay the ministers who plotted against them. The bottom line is that Daniel had 4 main characteristics which the remnant will possess at the end. Here they are. Number 1, he had the testimony of Jesus. Number 2, he kept the commandments of God. That includes the 4th commandment, the 7th-day Sabbath commandment. He was a staunch worshiper of the true God. And number 4, he had the faith of Jesus, which is an unbreakable confidence and trust in God, just like Jesus had. So that's something to take and think about as we compare ourselves to those 4 points. Where do I stand in relationship to those 4 points? All right, so finishing up here, it says at the end, God's people will gain the victory in the 4 areas in which Daniel and his friends were victorious. Number 1, God's people will not drink the wine of Babylon nor eat her food. The food and the wine represents Babylon's false doctrines and traditions. And there's lots of texts you can look up there. Number 2, God's people will refuse the name of the beast. In fact, they will have the name of God on their foreheads, or in their minds, is what it's talking about. Just as Daniel and his friends had godly names. The third one, God's people will not flinch at the false god of end-time Babylon. Though all power will appear to be on Babylon's side, though God's people will be a small minority, he will deliver them because he is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Amen. That's right. And the fourth one, God's people will refuse to be brainwashed by the false theories and traditions of Babylon. So I just thought that was worthwhile to copy and read it to you, as it kind of brings all that together for us as end-time people. I just want to see what time it was. Okay. All right, so keep those in your notebook there, and I hope that you will go back and maybe look up the texts that go with those. Maybe you could write them out on a separate sheet of paper and attach it to those. Okay, I do have one more handout I'll give you at the end. I had originally planned to read it, but it comes from Mervyn Maxwell's The Message of Daniel 1. about God cares for the Jews and for all of his people. Okay, so we can start and right now into chapter 2, and we'll see how far we get this morning because it's quite a detailed study in this one here. All right, so wherever we left off, we're in chapter 2 now. Let us begin. This is a long one. Let's kind of maybe see if I can break it up. Let's read 1 through 5 to start with, so it's not so long.
Judy, New King James Version. Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him.
Marge, New King James. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king.
And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream.
Fellas, and this is the New King James Version. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king of Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell your servants a dream, and we will give the interpretation.
This is Sue, verse 5 in King James Version. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not King James. I don't know how that got switched. I'm reading from the Darby version. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the command is gone forth from me. If ye do not make known unto me the dream and its interpretation, ye shall be cut in pieces in your houses, made a dunghill.
That's a scary one. I read that he had at least 1,000 of these men that worked for him. Magicians, soothsayers, astrologers, Chaldeans, magi, whatever. 1,000 of them. So that's quite a large number to execute. All right, so let me go back and start with verse 1. The Babylonians did not count the king's first year. His actual second year was his first year, and the second year would have been his third year. So Daniel's training would have been completed before the end of the king's second year, or in actuality, his third year. The dreams were regarded with awe and treated as coming from their gods. God himself, the true God, chose to communicate with Nebuchadnezzar in this manner because God wanted Nebuchadnezzar to know him. God is no respecter of persons. He seeks to save as many who are willing, whether they are Babylonians or Israelites. The dream was to reveal to Nebuchadnezzar that the course of history was ordained by the Most High and subject to his will. Nebuchadnezzar was shown his role in the plan of heaven, and so that he might have the opportunity to cooperate effectively with the divine program. The lessons of history given to Nebuchadnezzar were designed for the instruction of nations and men, and not just for him, but for nations, until the close of time. To every ancient nation, God assigned a special place in his great plan. When rulers failed, their glory was laid in the dust. Nations today should heed the lesson of past history. Above the constantly changing scene of international diplomacy, the great God of heaven sits enthroned, and from his calm eternity, he is silently and patiently working out the counsels of his own will. That's from Prophets and King, page 500. Eventually, stability and permanence will come when God himself, at the end of time, sets up his kingdom that will never be destroyed. You know, we look at the world, because I'm constantly watching the world news and what's going on, because I just am interested in that stuff. And I'm thinking we've got a war going on in Ukraine with Russia. We've got one in Israel and Hamas. We've got potential China and Taiwan, which would draw in all of that area. And God, it says, sits in his calm eternity, patiently and silently working out his counsels. So and I pray for these nations, remind God that Vladimir Putin is destroying not only his own people, but he's destroying the Ukrainian people, and they did nothing to provoke this war. And so I'm asking God if he would please bring this to a conclusion. So there's some reason for this to be taking place, spiritually and behind the scenes. We don't know why, but there's some reason. When I was watching a video last night on Adolf Hitler, which is one of my favorite subjects, Hitler said that they would have a 1,000-year Reich. Reich is the government. 1,000 years, Germany would rule the world, he said. It lasted 12 years. He forgot to read Daniel. Because, look what he did. God removed him because of what he was doing. He was destroying not only the Jews, but everybody else in his path. So I was thinking that same with Putin. These tens of thousands of young Russians have died in this totally useless, ridiculous war. There's no reason for it whatsoever. So I just feel like that God is going to step in at some point and deal with him because the way he's treating his people. Anyway, this is what this information here leads me to that conclusion that God will not allow it to go any further than he wants it to go. All right, so let me go to verse 2 now. The dream greatly disturbs the king, and he calls for his so-called wise men. Though the king had been deeply impressed by the dream, when he woke up, he could not remember it. In verse 4, the Chaldeans, which is another name for the wise men, they spoke to the king in the Aramaic language, and Daniel writes it out, their speech, in that language, and he writes other parts of his book in Hebrew. So we've got two languages going on here. Nebuchadnezzar was not a native Babylonian, but he no doubt knew a number of different languages, as did all government officials. So they asked the king to tell them the dream, and they would interpret it. The dream was purposely taken from Nebuchadnezzar so that the wise men could not place a false interpretation on it. Nebuchadnezzar's fury knows no bound. He threatens to literally cut them apart into pieces, which was a common punishment in ancient times. All right, so let's begin now, pick up again and see what happens. If we stopped at 5, let's read 6 through 12, and then we'll probably have to stop there. Where's my clock? Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Dawn reading from the New American Standard Bible, verse 6. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. Therefore, declare to me the dream and its interpretation.
Sharon, King James Version, verse 7. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream. We will give its interpretation.
I'm Betty, and this is the New King James Version, verse 8. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time because you see that my decision is firm.
This is Trish, New King James. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation.
Kathy, NIV, verse 10. The astrologers answered the king, there is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer.
Maryland, the NIV version. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men.
Kristen, New King James, verse 12. For this reason the king was angry and very furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon.
Okay, beginning with verse 8, Nebuchadnezzar is growing suspicious that his so-called wise men are stalling for time. The gods were believed to communicate with the ruler through the wise men, but Nebuchadnezzar's counselors don't have any answer or a word from the gods. Is Nebuchadnezzar growing suspicious that his gods are not really the real thing? Remember, this is a conflict between worship and gods and whose God you're going to worship in the bigger picture of things. In verse 9, the dialogue between the king and his counselors heats up, as does the king's anger. As king, he has the last word, and he pronounces a death decree on all the wise men of his kingdom. If they were so worthless that they could not do what he asked of them, he would do away with all of them. In verse 10, the wise men are now compelled to admit their inability to answer the king's demands. It was beyond human power, and besides, no king ever made such an unrealistic request of his counselors. In verse 11, the wise men and the counselors have to admit that their gods are limited. The lesser gods, who were supposed to communicate with men, were not responding, and the higher God, that these are gods that no humans could communicate with because they were so high up. The admittance of failure provided Daniel a unique opportunity to reveal something of the power of God, the God he served and worshiped. And in verse 12, the king orders the execution of all the counselors, all of them, not just a few, not just the ones standing in the room. It was, like I said, there was about 1,000 of them, so it was not that many could come out. They probably called them out during the night and have them come meet the king. These are probably the older members of this Chaldeans. The king ordered the execution of all his counselors, which was a bold step, seeing that these men were of the learned class of society. Imagine destroying all the men they were probably professors, they were probably teachers at the university, besides being in the counseling position to the king, and he's going to wipe them all out. So we will have to stop right there to find out what happens next week. Now, let me give you this handout sheet called The Message of Daniel 1. This is just for your benefit to read if you want to. You don't have to. Sorry, I'll give you some. One, 2, 3. Need some more? Here.
His people could not interpret the dream because the dream came from God. Not just a dream.
Oh, well, you should bring that out. That's good. Get a microphone. Just raise your hand. That's right. Exactly right. That's a good point. Need some? Everybody go this way. One more? All right, over here. Has everybody got one now? I think I made 40 of these.
No, I gave it back to her.
I wanted to share with you, we went to Sight and Sounds, which was, they have the theater in Lancaster and also in Branson, Missouri, and we saw the play of Daniel. And we were amazed at how biblically accurate it was. Have you all been there? Who's been to see it? I tried to, what I wanted to do is show it the last day that we meet, but they are not releasing it because they're going to show it in the theaters either in, I think for a couple of days in either August or September. So I will let you know. It is so on target, and the figure that comes out of the image, thank you, it was just unbelievable. But even the visions of the beast and all this stuff, it was so biblically accurate. It was just amazing. And so I would encourage, I don't go to movies I've probably been to 5 movies in my life, but it was very, very good, and I would encourage you to go because the play
it'll be taken live. It's going to be the play that they're put on the screen. It's not a theater movie. So it'll be very much like what we saw. But I just would encourage you to see it because it's well worth your time. Thank you. And are we ready? We're going to be, would you like to pray?
Now we're going to close in prayer before we start our personal prayers, okay? Father God, this has been such a wonderful time that we've had diving into your word and learning more about you, drawing close to you. May we apply the things that we learn towards our lives, Lord, that we may be ready when you come, Father. Thank you for everything you do. Continue to bless Fran in this ministry. And through this ministry, help us to bless others. This is our prayer today in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.